Everybody, my name is Poonam Hingorani, and I would like to welcome you all to ISW's next workshop in the series, Navigating the College Application Process. As all of you, if you have joined us in our previous webinars, know we created CollegeConnect. It's our goal towards creating a network so that we can support each other in this process. College admission process has a lot of moving parts, and so we wanted to bring this webinar series so that, increase awareness about all aspects of this application process. So today our focus is going to be on standardized tests and all that we need to know about them. So we'll start the webinar with a presentation by Donna Cox of Cox Tutoring Group. Donna has been preparing students for SAT and ACT since 2003. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions as you think of them, or you can use our chat feature and send us any questions, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation, where we will have a Q&A session. In addition to Donna, we also have a couple of students who are going to talk about their experiences with the standardized tests. Sanjay and I will be moderating the Q&A session. So I want to let everyone know that this session is being recorded, and we will email this session to all our registered members. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Donna. Shaman is going to talk a little bit about ISW, and then we're going to pass it over to Donna. So Shaman, take it away.
Yep. Hi, just welcome everyone. It's great. We're almost towards the end of our sessions. And any questions you have, do reach out to us. You have our email address. We've been sending you messages. So this is great. Can I have Donna?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for, thank you for inviting me to come in and present to you. I think I'll start with the first test that students should think about taking, and that is the PSAT. It's meant for juniors, but many schools invite their sophomores, and some schools even invite their freshmen to come and take that test. The PSAT is high school based, which means that the information comes from your child's high school in early in the school year, late September, early October, perhaps. The test is given at your student's high school in October. I believe it's generally the third Saturday in October for the public schools. Private schools tend to give the PSAT on a school day, typically the Wednesday before the Saturday that the public schools give the test. So that's the where and the when. The why is for freshmen and sophomores. It's strictly to prepare you, to give you, to get your feet wet on that test, to see what it looks like. The PSAT is slightly shorter. The math is a little easier than the SAT, but the verbal pieces are pretty much the same level of difficulty as the regular SAT. This test is a little shorter. When the SAT had an essay, which it doesn't anymore, the PSAT did not. So it's a 4-section test: reading, writing and language, math without calculator, and math with calculator, in that order. Again, for the sophomores, it's just a practice. It's a way of making them not take it for the first time when it counts. They can take it in 10th grade just to see what it looks like. In 11th grade, that's the one that counts. The PSAT test in 11th grade is also the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, NumSquat for short. Your child will get a NumSquat score in 10th grade, but he or she will not be entered into that consideration until the test from their junior year. Those junior year tests that qualify for National Merit consideration are sent to the National Merit Organization, and we'll talk a little bit later about what the implications of that test are. So PSAT, all the information comes from your school, and your child takes it at the school that he or she attends in October. The SAT and ACT are the two college standardized application tests. Each of them is given 7 times a year. There are better times to take them than other times, and I'll tell you the why of that. The SAT is given 7 times a year, but it makes more sense to look at the year as being more the school year rather than the calendar year. So SAT is given in October, November, December, the first Saturday of each of those 3 months. It's given in mid-March, mid-May, early May, sorry, beginning of June, and the end of August. So 7 times. Of those 7 times, there are 3 times, March, May, and October, where a more detailed score is available for your child. So the March, May, and October tests offer something called the QAS. It's the question and answer service. It provides your student with a copy of the actual test that he or she took with their actual answers, along with details on the level of difficulty of the question, the category of the question, the type of question that it is. So that is, it's a gold mine for a second test, a second take of the test. For that reason, I think the March test is the best one to take for your first time, because the March one does provide the QAS. It comes, your results come fairly quickly. You would have those results back certainly in time to address remaining areas of difficulty to take the June test, maybe even the May. Typically the SAT results come back in about 2 to 3 weeks. The June test takes a little bit longer. Was that a question?
No. Can you just? Okay.
Okay. So March, the March test, middle of March is when I would recommend that that first test be taken. The ACT is another just as widely accepted college application test. It's also given 7 times a year. Those 7 are mid-September, mid-October, mid-December, mid-April, mid-June, mid-July, and did I miss one? Did I say October? September, October, December, February is the one I missed. I'm sorry. February, April, June, and July. The ACT has a similar offering to the QAS. That's called the TIR. God knows why they don't use the same initials, but they don't. The TIR stands for Test Information Release Form. That is available for the April, June, and December tests. So if a student feels ready in December, that's a good time to take the first ACT. It's early though. Most students will not be ready to take a standardized test as soon as December of their junior year. Both tests are aimed at second semester juniors, so that they've had at least a year and a half of algebra, a year of geometry. Students who are advanced in math and are taking pre-calculus as juniors, that's certainly an advantage. The ACT does go a little bit into pre-calc. The SAT does not tend to go too much into pre-calc. Okay, so as far as the preparation goes, I often am asked for prep for kids who are freshmen and sophomores in high school, and that's really too early. They just haven't had the background in high school, math, English, reading, history. Even though there is no actual history test, the readings do presume that the student has had some US history and world history. It's certainly to their advantage to know something about those subjects so that they have some background when they read the reading passages. The differences, let me describe the SAT to you in a little more detail than I did before. The SAT consists of 4 independent tests, independent meaning, self-contained. You do all of the reading at once, all of the writing and language at once. So the 4 sections of the SAT are reading. Reading first, 5 passages. The first is fiction. Second and fourth are history-based. Third and fifth are science-based. It certainly helps if you're good at history, good at science, but it's not any specific specific knowledge is not, there's no listing of specific things that you need to know. It is a reading test. Any information that you know surrounding the topic that they're speaking about is certainly helpful. Each of those tests, each of those reading passages rather, has an average of 13 minutes to be done. It's a 65-minute test, 5 passages each. Let's see, what else can I tell you about that? The fiction is often easier for girls than it is for boys. We ladies tend to be a little more empathetic than our male counterparts. No offense to the men watching. Men, in the aggregate, tend to be better at the nonfiction passages. My advice for that for my students is if you start reading a passage and it's over your head, or you feel not terribly confident about the subject matter, then skip that one, send it to the end and do it last. So again, 65 minutes for that test, 13 minutes average for each of the passages. That's followed by, I should tell you also, 2 of those passages may have graphs or charts or tables or figures in them with 2 or 3 questions about those graphs and tables. Those questions are testing your ability to find information from a graph or a table. That is the SAT's answer to the ACT science tests. The ACT science is all about reading graphs and tables, so not to be outdone by their rival, the ACT, the SAT does put some graph and table and chart and figure questions in with their reading passages and also with their writing and language. So the writing and language test is second in the SAT. It is a 44 question test. 4 passages, 11 questions each, on various topics. They can be history topics. They can be current events. They can be topics of interest, current interest. They can be science-based as well. 4 of them, and this is, they don't call it English for a reason, because it's not just grammar rules. It's not just grammar, structure, punctuation. It has a lot of questions about the craft of writing, the writing of a well-constructed paragraph. Lots of questions about transitions, how to start this paragraph so that it gets you from the idea of the previous paragraph into the idea of this paragraph. Many of the questions are very quick, a little bit of a piece of the sentence that's underlined, and you simply have to pick the best version of that underlined bit to go into that sentence. But many of the questions are much more involved, much more complicated than that. Questions like, which of the following most smoothly and effectively does whatever it is that they want it to do? And there's not a lot of clues in those. Smoothly and effectively basically means something that the people who wrote the question would think is smooth and effective, not necessarily what you yourself might think is smooth and effective. So good to know how to navigate those questions as well. So four passages there, 11 questions each, 35 minutes to do that one. The reading, I don't think I mentioned, the reading has 52 questions spread over the 5 passages, 65 minutes. The third section is math without calculator. And the without calculator section does require that you remember how to do long division without a calculator, for example. They tend to put a lot of computational questions in the no calculator section, just to make sure that you can still add, subtract, multiply, and divide on your own without the help of a calculator. That section is 20 questions long. 15 of those questions are ABCD, multiple choice. And the last 5 are what I call do-it-yourself questions. There are no answers to choose from. The student must find an answer on his or her own and mark that answer in a little grid. As I said before, the math is everything that you've learned, anything that you've learned from middle school through high school. Many of the questions require that you marry something that you learned in 4th grade with something that you learned last week. They are very good at writing questions that require multiple steps, using multiple knowledge that you've obtained over the last 4 or 5 years. They are very good at that. It's very different from a test that you take in school. The tests that we take in school, it's a test on Unit 4. So if Unit 4 is quadratic equation, then when you take a test on Unit 4, you expect everything to be about the quadratic equation. So the information that you need has a little fence around it. When you take the SAT, there are no fences. The SAT can ask you questions that require you to know something from 5 years ago, married to something, as I said, that you learned last week. Section 4 of the SAT is math with calculator. Students tend to like this one better. It's longer. So there are a few more questions that are classified as easy or medium. It takes a while before they get into the hard questions, but 50% of section 4 is typically labeled hard questions. Of those questions, there are 30 that are multiple choice A, B, C, D, and 8 that are do it yourself, figure out the answer, and put that answer into a little grid that the computer will read and get your answers. Let's see. All right, timing of the preparation. Now let me describe the ACT first. But before I do that, I always forget this part. There is a 5th section in the SAT. It's either reading, writing and language, or math. You don't know until you get your particular test. The one that you're doing may be different from the one that the 2 people sitting on either side of you are doing. Part of it counts towards your score, part of it doesn't. And that's about all I can tell you, because the SAT is very, very closed-mouthed about how that works exactly. I fail to see how it can be a standardized test if that 5th section is different for every child and doesn't, some of it counts and some of it doesn't. And as many ways as I have described that 5th section in the what do you want to know box at the SAT, I've not been able to find anything any better than that. Some of it, that's all they'll tell you, some of it counts towards your score. So I tell my students that it's coming. I tell them to be attentive to it, because you don't know which parts of it might count towards your score and which don't. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the SAT just said that just to make people pay attention, because that's the way they are at the SAT. They are not fond of high school kids. I tell my students that the SAT people hate them because they just want their high school experience to be miserable. Not sure if that's actually true, but that's my point of view. Okay, ACT. ACT is also 5 sections. First one is English. They call it English. They don't call it writing and language because it's 75 questions in 45 minutes. So it's very quick. Most of the questions are grammar, structure, punctuation. Most of it is rules based. Most of it is not smooth and effective. There are a few of the smooth and effective type questions. The more the questions where you have to look backwards to see where has the story come from and look forward to see where's the story going from here, but not as much as the SAT. They appreciate the fact that they're asking kids to answer 75 questions in 45 minutes, and so they make the bulk of those questions, the very large percentage of those questions can be answered fairly quickly. Okay, so English, again, they're separated, the 75 questions are separated into 5 passages, 15 questions each. The ACT, at least to this point, has not put any graphs or charts into their English passages. So English first. The second section is math. Math, 60 questions, 60 minutes. So you have to move along quickly. The ACT math is easier at the beginning, harder at the end. So the more quickly you can get through the first third or so, the more time you'll have to do the questions that are not 60-second questions towards the end of the test. I would say for kids who are in Algebra 2 as juniors. If they're taking the test at the end during their second semester of junior year, that the first 45 to 48 questions or so are covering information that they have already studied. The last dozen or so questions may drift into things that only the Algebra 2 honors kids will get to during the year. Things that the kids who are taking pre-calc will be much more comfortable with than will the Algebra 2 kids. So there are strategies for doing the best that you can on those last 12 to 15 questions that might be out of your real comfort zone. The third section of the ACT is reading. This is, as far as I know, nobody's favorite. I don't know if Mahathi will back me up on that, but the ACT reading is 4 passages: fiction, history, humanities, natural science, always in that order. 4 passages, 10 questions each, 35 minutes. So again, ACT, the biggest difference between SAT and ACT is the timing. You have to move very quickly in order to get all 4 of those reading passages done in the very paltry 35 minutes that they give you. The passages, they're deliberately distributed over those categories so that one student who's very good at, let's say, science wouldn't get 1 fiction and 3 science passages. Okay, both tests try very hard not to advantage a student who is very good at the humanities but not great at science, or the other way around. They're pretty evenly distributed. Again, I tell my male students sometimes if they can't identify with the main character in the fiction at the beginning of the test, that it's okay to push that fiction piece back and do it at the end. But it is very challenging to get those 4 passages done in that 35 minutes that you're given. The fourth section in ACT is science. Not necessarily science knowledge, although obviously if you're good at science, you'll find this a little bit easier. It's mostly science reading. It's mostly finding the right answer from graphs and charts and tables and figures. The questions are arranged so that you get a very broad hint first, and then the questions really consist of a series of hints, ever more specific, until you get to the point where you are ready to go and find that answer on the graph or the chart. The science section has 6 passages in it. 5 of them are largely go find the answer on the graph or the chart. One of them is what I call the fight passage, and that one has no graphs, no charts. That one is the presentation of an experiment and the results, or a study and the results, and 2 or 3 or 4 points of view from students or scientists or just hypotheses, and their reactions or their interpretations of that study or that experiment. So there you do have to go find the answers in each of those points in the explanation, the paragraph of information from each of those points of view. That one arguably is the most difficult because it isn't just paying attention to detail and looking for patterns on the graphs and charts and tables and figures. The ACT also has a 5th section, but they tell you straight out it does not count towards your score. It's used for what they call normalizing. It's used for testing out new types of questions. If they've never given a question in the math section on ellipses or hyperbolas, for example, something like that would have showed up in that 5th section first. And that's how they determine the level of difficulty. Where would a question like that be placed if it were to be put in a new test later on? So when a student is writing the essay on the ACT, and I don't expect the ACT essay to last very much longer now that the SAT has given up on having an essay section at the end of their test. I expect the ACT will follow suit fairly soon. But if it doesn't, and if you do decide to write that essay, then don't worry too much about that 5th section. Give your brain a rest, because you're going to have to write an essay after that section. Those 5th sections in both tests are fairly short. They're not, they're not 45 minutes. They're not, an hour. They're 15 or 20 minutes. So, but be careful that there is that 5th section, and you don't get a choice. You have to sit there and do it. Okay, scoring. The SAT has gone back and forth, 1600, 2400. They're back to 1600 now. The reading section is scored on a scale of 1 to 40. The writing and language is scored on a scale of 1 to 40. They add those two scores together and stick a 0 at the end, and that's the score that you'll see. That's the big score that you see when you get your score sheet. You'll have the big score between 400 and 1600, and then that's broken down into EBRW, which is evidence-based reading and writing. That's the reading score, the writing score, put it together, add a 0 on the end of it. The math score is, they give you just a single math score, and that's from 200 to 800. They add those two scores together, and that's your final score on a scale of 1600 again. For a while, the scale was 2400. They gave the reading and the writing separate scores up to 800. That version of the SAT went out of use in January of 2016, I believe it was 2016. The ACT is scored, so the SAT, you add the EBRW and the math scores together. The ACT, each of the individual tests is scored from 1 to 36. And their final score is called the composite, and it's an average of the 4. So they add those 4 together, divide by 4, and that's your composite. If your composite score has a 0.5 or a 0.75 after it, then they bump that up. They round up in the student's favor. The matchup, a 26 on the ACT is about a 1250 on the SAT, and that's about 80th percentile. The 26, 27 is about 80th percentile on the ACT. So 1250 is about 80th percentile on the SAT. Okay, so the way we do test prep, the normal start time for juniors is right after the October SAT because a lot of seniors are still testing at that point. If you start in October, then you would be targeting the March SAT and most likely the April ACT. If you do that, if you start your testing, your prepping in October, then you can be done by the time your junior year ends. You will not have to go into the summer before senior year with that hanging over your head. There are enough other things to do in the summer before junior year. There are exceptions.
So Donna, if I can interrupt in relation to what you're just speaking, we have a question.
Okay.
Do students have to prepare for all three exams, PSAT, SAT, and ACT for college admissions? And do they complete it by junior year or senior year?
Okay. The PSAT is not required. It's there. It's there for practice. I mean, that's its purpose. Practice SAT. It's there for practice. For high achieving students, it is the only way to get into the national merit qualifying system. If you're in that 1/2%, that's about who gets into the PSAT. Into the national merit recognition area. The score is about it's about a 210, and let me tell you where that comes from. Because the older SAT had 3 sections, reading, writing, and math, the national merit hasn't quite caught up yet to the 1600 score now. So you would take your combined reading and writing score, without the 0 in the end. So let's say you have 35 in both of those. That would be 70. You would multiply that by 2, so 140 for that. And let's say you got a 730 on the math. You would lop off the 0 and add the 73 to the 140. That would be a 213, and that would get you a letter of commendation nationwide. Okay. Just last year's, it wiggles a little bit, but last year's qualifying score was a 209. So 209, you get a letter of commendation, and that's the first step into the national merit process. So PSAT, it's all the high schools in this area, because they are so good. They do encourage their juniors, all of their juniors, to take it. Just for practice, because most of the juniors in the schools around here will be college bound. So most colleges in the years, not the COVID years, most colleges that kids around here would aspire to go to probably require SATs and ACTs. Last year's class and this year's class, different. The 20s, the 21s, and the 22s, because of COVID. A lot of colleges have relaxed that requirement. If you think that SAT is the best test for your child, then they don't. The short answer to your question is no, they don't have to take all 3. PSAT strongly recommended, and either or both of the SAT or the ACT colleges will take, every college in the country will take either of them without prejudice, or both. So if your high school doesn't give the pre-ACT, which is the ACT equivalent of the PSAT, I can provide one of those so a student can see whether they like that one better. Some kids prefer and do better on one than the other. So I think it's to a student's advantage to have a chance to take both The PSAT they'll all take in school. Hopkinton is the only school I know off the top of my head that gives the pre-ACT. They give the pre-ACT to their sophomores, they give the PSAT to their juniors. So those kids get a taste of both of them. Very often, your high achieving student will do really well on both. So that student could do one SAT, one ACT, and be done. Most kids don't get off that easily. If you take one of each, then we compare the scores. If they're very similar, and if the student doesn't have a strong preference for one over the other, my recommendation would be to take both of them again, and then decide which of those scores that you want the organization to report to your colleges. But colleges will take either or both, whatever you want to, whichever you want to send to them. Okay, did that sufficiently answer the question? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Okay. So exceptions to the rule of waiting until October to start is kids who took the SAT as sophomores, which was not a thing this year. This year's sophomores largely were not offered the PSAT, again, because of COVID, because of having just the junior class come in so that they could be socially distanced, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't have a good baseline for the 10th, the kids who are just leaving 10th grade now. If your student is a consistently A student, then we just assume that student has the potential to be recognized by national merit. That kind of student should start prep in the summer so that they get a great deal of the prep before the October, third weekend in October-ish PSAT. So those kids should start early. Kids who are likely to be recruited to play sports in college should also start early, because college coaches want early scores. And if the student has had no prep, that's not fair to the student, not that the college coaches care. The college coach, if a coach is looking at a student and that student takes an early SAT when he or she is not really ready or not really prepared, then that coach may say, oh, maybe I should look for somebody else. So we like to give those kids the opportunity to get some prep at least before they take that PSAT. Okay, but the normal start time is October. Okay. Okay. So you might wonder, how does the reporting of your scores to the colleges work? Here I've got to explain score choice and super score. So score choice is something that we, the parents, the student, the people on your side of the fence, that we have control over. We can decide once the scores are all in, when it's time to send that application in, everything's, all the information is in there. We tell the SAT organization and the ACT organization which of the scores from which dates we want to be reported to our colleges. Most colleges are okay with score choice. Some of them are not. If you are applying to a college that does not believe in score choice, that means they want to see all of your scores from 9th grade on. So not the Johns Hopkins talented youth program that you take in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. Okay, those scores don't have to be reported anywhere. But if you decided to take an SAT just to see how it was in ninth grade and you didn't do very well, and you just as soon, take those scores and hide them under the rug. You don't have that option if the college does not support, does not accept score choice. So be careful that you don't encourage your kids to take the real thing too early, because it might not be to their advantage later on. So score choice is you deciding which scores to send to the colleges. And the caveat is you cannot pick and choose the math from one day and the EBRW from a different day. If you want them to see your March EBRW and your May math, you must send the entire score from math and from March and from May. And then the college will decide what to do with those scores. Same thing for the ACT. You tell the ACT which scores you want them to send, and they send every score, the 4 individual scores and the composite from each of the dates that you choose to send. So that brings me to SuperScore. SuperScore is the college's responsibility. We don't, unfortunately, we don't get to decide, how they do their SuperScore. Most colleges will take your best EBRW from one date and your best math from a different date if they happen to be different, and then put those two together, and that's the SAT score that follows your application through the rest of the process. If a college doesn't cherry pick in that way, they will take your highest combined score, and that's the score that follows your application. ACT, on the other hand, starting with the class of 22, ACT is going to report your SuperScore for you. So they will prominently display your best English, math, reading, science, and put those together and give you your SuperScore prominently displayed. Hey, college person, here is Mahati's score. And it's all her best ones. And then they give the other ones as a backup, okay? But what is prominently displayed is the best of each of those from whichever date that best score comes. So that is brand new. They just started doing that. They will just start doing that for the class of 22. So that is a very lovely thing. That way the colleges don't have to do any extra work. So that means that many colleges that didn't SuperScore the ACT now almost won't have a choice, because the ACT will send those scores for the kids. Another thing that the ACT will start in the fall of 22. They were going to start it this year, but then COVID happened, so they pushed a few things. They were going to start the SuperScore thing this year too, but they pushed it out. Another thing that they are starting in the fall of 22 is single section retesting, which is awesome. If I had one student just recently who scored very nicely, very, in the high 20s on everything except the reading. The reading just kicked his butt. So if he were 2 years younger, and if he were taking this 2 years from now, he would be able to redo just the one reading test, which is kind of a nice thing. Hasn't happened yet. It will start in the fall of 22. Okay, let me see here. Okay, I think that's kind of everything I had in my outline. So if anyone has any questions, if there's anything that you that you want to know that I didn't cover, I'm certainly open to answering any questions.
The question I had is like, what do you think is the ACT, SAT, is that more important than your GPA, or how do you weigh those?
We poor kids, they tend to stress so much over their SAT and ACT scores, but when you get right down to it, that is a score on a test on one day. So the GPA is more important. The GPA is the best indicator of success of that student in college. It's the best indicator of how well that student will do, because it's 4 years of high school. So colleges understand that the freshman year, might be a little not so great, because it's the first time you're changing classes. There's a lot of there's a lot to get used to. A lot of kids don't start to take school seriously until maybe the sophomore year. So what colleges look for in a GPA is growth. They look for challenging yourself. If you are consistently getting A's in college prep courses, and you don't ever stretch yourself and take an honors level, those A's don't mean as much. If you're all honors courses and you never take an AP course, even though they're offered to you, then that's not something that the colleges look at very favorably either. They like to see your stretch. If you get a B plus in an AP course, and that's 2 grades lower than you usually get in an honors level, that's okay, because it's an AP course. They like to see that stretch. Part of what goes to the colleges, and this is the guidance department's responsibility. What goes to the colleges along with your application is what's called the high school profile. And that tells the college what is offered at your high school. So for example, if your high school has a rule that says no sophomore is invited to take an AP course. So obviously, if you don't have any APs in your sophomore year, it's because you weren't allowed to. So colleges, they have a lot of work to do with these applications. They look to see, were you offered an AP? If you were, did you take it? Did you, in courses that you do very well in, that you're very interested in, that are related to your proposed major in college, did you stretch? Did you take some of those AP courses? And the high school profile will go along with that, so that the college can see how competitive is your high school, and did you take advantage of those courses that would get you ready for for your high school career. They tend to discount A's in courses like orchestra, unless of course you're going to Juilliard, obviously. But a lot of high schools, in the high school that my kids went to, orchestra was a course, and it had a grade along with it. And my kids got A's in orchestra, but I'm sure the colleges didn't pay a whole lot of attention to that, because none of them studied music in college. So colleges, your GPA, basically, how well you're doing. But just, if I put, the center of a 5-mile radius circle at my office, there are a lot of high schools within that 5-mile radius, and not 2 of them do their calculation of the GPA in the same way. Okay, Algonquin, Westboro, Shrewsbury, none of the three of them does an AP course in the same way. At one school, an AP course gets a 5.0 if it's an A. At another school, it's a 4.5. Another school is a 4.3. So colleges don't just blindly take your GPA and say this is what it is. They recompute. They leave out whatever whatever their particular way of doing it is. They each have their own way of figuring it out, so that it's more like comparing apples to apples rather than apples to oranges.
So piggybacking on that, we have another question. What is a typical good GPA for admission process?
Depends on the college. If you go to the college website, that is one of the things that they report. They'll report their mid 50%. So they'll give you how many. They'll break the GPAs down and then tell you percentage wise their last entering freshman class for which they know those specs. They'll give you both the 25th and 75th percentile mark for SATs and ACTs, and they'll give you what percentage of their entering freshman class, what their GPAs were as recalculated by the school. So there are schools that you wonder if anybody ever goes there, because their 75th percentile mark for the ACT is a 35, and their 25th percentile mark is a 34. So like, who goes there? Only the kids who, and even then, you can present with a perfect looking profile, perfect SATs, perfect ACTs, and they don't want you for some reason for that. You don't fill a little spot that they're looking for. I have a friend who's been a college applications consultant forever, and she says, we worry about being well-rounded students, and colleges don't want well-rounded students. They want a well-rounded student body made up of pointy students. That's her. That if you have a particular specialty, if there's something unusual about you, if the tuba player in the marching band graduated last spring, then they're going to be looking for a new tuba player for the marching band. So you never know why a student who seems to be a perfect fit for a particular school isn't accepted. Maybe they have enough kids from Massachusetts already. You never know. It's they do it all behind the curtain. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, because he doesn't know. We don't know what goes on back there behind that curtain.
I have another question. I believe it's from a student. Can we use a Texas Instrument graphing calculator on the SAT calculator math and ACT math?
I know for a fact that the TI-84, yes, is acceptable. That the list of acceptable calculators is a matter of record. It must be on the SAT website somewhere, but I know that the one that most kids use is the TI-84, and it is acceptable. What's not acceptable is calculators that beep or squeak or creak or do any funny sounds. That no calculator that can access the internet is allowed. But the TI-84, that's sort of the standard that most kids are taught to use, at least in pre-calc classes. So that one, if that's the one that you're familiar with, then that's perfectly fine.
And a follow-up to that question is, does the whole ACT math section allow a calculator?
Yes, it does. ACT does not hate you as much as the SAT does. So they do allow you to use your calculator all the way through. Yes.
So I'm just gonna shift to now. I'm gonna ask Mahiti, who's a student here, if she can share with us some of her experiences. And thank you so much for joining us, Mahiti. Please introduce yourself and just give us some of your, insight of your experiences with these tests.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mahati. I am a current junior at Shrewsbury High School, and I'm going into my senior year. And I took the ACT twice, and I took the PSAT once in sophomore year, once in junior year. And I have not taken the SAT, and I will not be taking the SAT. So when I took the PSAT the first time, I kind of knew that it didn't really count. So I knew that it was kind of just like an introductory sort of test for the SAT. So I didn't really try that hard in sophomore year. And then when I took it in junior year, I knew that it counted for like the NMSQT, the National Merit Program. So I did try a little harder, and there was an improvement from sophomore year to junior year. So I was proud of myself for having that improvement. And I think overall through the standardized testing journey, the ACT taking it twice was probably the biggest part of it. So when I first started like preparing for testing, I thought that I would take the SAT because that was the one that was like most well known, and that's the one that everyone I knew was taking. But after doing like a lot of like practice tests and stuff like that, Donna actually prepared me for the ACT first, and with that, I felt like I was more comfortable doing the ACT. So I took it for the first time in February of 2021, and I did relatively well. I got a 34 composite out of 36. So I was,
Wow.
yeah, I knew that I wanted to take it again to see if I could improve in certain sections. And when I took it in April of 2021 as well, I did better. I also got a 34 composite, but my individual scores were better. So it showed me my composite for the super score when I went to check my scores, and that was a 35 composite. So knowing that the ACT sends super scores without sending like the individual tests, I think that was really reassuring for me because I knew that it would take the best things that I've done. So like in the reading, I did really well in the reading on the first test, but not as well in the second test. So if it sends just the reading from the first test, in which I did really well, plus the, say like the math or the science from the second test, where I did better than I did on the first test, I think that's better than just sending one test at a time, where I didn't do as well on certain things, or another test where I did better on one thing and not that great on the other.
Oh, if I could go back to the National Merit Qualifying Test, that threshold that I talked about, the 209, 210, something in that area, that gives you a letter of commendation. To get further into the National Merit process, there is a different qualifying score for each state. And it depends on the scores of the kids in that year in that state. So Massachusetts, because we, are very high up on the educational ladder, our qualifying score for semifinalists is 223. I think that's what the last one was 223. And if you meet that threshold, then before just this past year, you had to take an SAT and report your SAT scores to get you from semifinalist to finalist status. So that there was that one extra. Starting this year, however, and thank you for reminding me of that, Mahati, by just not directly, but it made me think. Starting this year, the National Merit Organization will take your ACT score as qualifying from semifinalist to finalist status. That was brand new this year. It used to be only the SAT, a subsequent SAT after the PSAT would get you from semifinalist to finalist status. And at every threshold, there are fewer and fewer kids. And at the very, very top of that pyramid, there are a very small number of kids who are actually named national merit winners. They get a small scholarship from the National Merit Organization itself. But anyone with national merit recognition in their profile, those are the kids that colleges throw money at. Those are the kids that colleges offer merit scholarships to. Colleges fight over kids with any kind of national merit recognition in their profiles.
So, Donna, to clarify on that, until last year, it was just the PSAT and then the SAT. Now going forward, it's the PSAT and the SAT or the ACT.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question that we have is, some of these universities are test optional. Does it make sense sending scores to them?
Yes. Test optional does not mean test blind. So test optional, the well-known colleges that typically would require test scores to be submitted because of the crazy situation over the last 15, 16 months. For the class of 20 and the class of 21, they lifted the requirement for testing because there were many kids who just didn't get in the class of 20 and 21 who just didn't get a chance to test at all. They would register and the test would get canceled, and they would register for the next one and the test would get canceled. So through no fault of their own, they had no scores to submit. So colleges really didn't have much of a choice than to say, well, you don't have to submit SAT or ACT scores, especially for the class of 20. For the class of 21, they've had a little bit more of a chance because the two organizations added extra test days, or tried to, last fall. So they had a little bit more of a chance to take the tests. If you are the high achieving student, then it is definitely worth your while to keep trying to take it and to submit. Kids in the class of, even the class of 22, a lot of the kids are just kind of sitting back and saying, okay, well, it's going to be test optional, so I'm not going to bother to take the test. But if you take two kids who are pretty much, look pretty much alike, and one of them kept registering and trying and took the test and has SAT or ACT scores to present, and the other one doesn't, then the kid who persevered, took the SAT or the ACT and presented those scores will be looked at more favorably than the kids who didn't. So that's what I mean by test optional is not test blind. The colleges will see those, and they will take those scores into consideration.
True. The reason I also brought this up is before COVID hit us, we still had some colleges that were test optional. And what we had heard at that time was, if you have a good score, send it. And so I guess that still stands, basically, even in the future, if they stay test optional.
Yes, you want to give the colleges as many reasons to accept you as possible. So, a good profile, a good extracurriculars, good test scores, all of that counts in.
This question will go to both Donna from your perspective and Mahiti from your perspective. What kind of materials, books, practice books do you think are better for students to use to prepare for these tests?
Okay, only the books that were published by the makers of the test. So not Princeton Review, not Kaplan, not Barron's, not anything except the official SAT prep book that is published by the College Board and the official ACT prep book published by the ACT. The most compelling reason for especially the SAT, the reading questions on the SAT, no one really does a good job of mimicking the questions that the SAT question writers write, especially the reading. I've looked at other, the Princetons and the Kaplans and the Barrons, and their questions, their sample questions for the reading just aren't the same as questions on the SAT. They're not as carefully written. They're not as specific. So before there was as much SAT material for this particular version of the SAT, you kind of had no choice, but if you wanted to do a bunch of practice tests, which I did when I first started with this version of the SAT, because I had to know it before I could teach it. So I did buy all, every kind of prep book I could get my hands on, and this is going to sound like like I'm tooting my own horn here, but I get perfect scores all the time. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting in this seat. And I don't get perfect scores on the reading from Princeton and from Kaplan because I know the SAT. I know the way they ask the questions. I know what to look for in their questions. And if I can't get an 800 on a Princeton Review, practice test that mimics the SAT, it's not me. It's the fact that their questions, they're just not exactly. I teach, most teachers hate teaching to the test, but that's what I do. I teach the test. I know this test inside and outside, upside, downside, backwards. And it's not, the other publishers of prep books just do not do as good a job. They're not as precise. They don't mimic the SAT question types as well as they should to be good practice. So don't do it. The math is fine. Math is easy to mimic, but the reading is absolutely not. So at least as far as the reading goes on the SAT, only College Board published in material.
I'm guessing, Mahiti, you would concur with what Donna said.
Yeah, I definitely think that doing a lot of practice.
CollegeConnect ittala shoes bodidu adan keliskonkoತೀನಿ.
Doing a lot of practice tests made it to sort of simulate the actual experience of taking the test, and I got to see what kinds of questions there were, and that would be on the test itself. So definitely finding something that was made by the creators of each test would definitely be more helpful than finding something that someone tried to mimic. So yeah.
So one more question that I have is for now that you talked about sending scores to the schools, and we have the composite set and the super scores, etc., etc. But is there a certain strategy that students can pursue in making sure they put the best foot forward as far as sending scores is concerned?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to at least take one of each, take the SAT, take the ACT. You can't take the ACT without, college schools, high schools that don't give their kids an opportunity to take the pre-ACT really have no way of knowing how they would do on the ACT, how they would react to the ACT, unless they can take a practice one on their own, or in a simulated environment. I have a good backlog of real previously administered both SATs and ACTs, and except for the COVID years, I do, and I will probably try to do that again this fall. I do invite the students who are tutoring with us to come in and take an ACT under real conditions in a room with a group of other kids with a proctor, and it's a previously administered ACT. It's totally real, but the scores don't go anywhere except to me and the student and the student's parents. So it's a no risk way of getting their feet wet on the ACT if their school doesn't give it to them. And I do that and invite students in the fall of their junior year to come in and do that. So it's about the same time frame when they're taking the PSAT. So you look at the PSAT scores, they come back between Thanksgiving and Christmas, typically. So you have that score, you have the score from the mock ACT. And, again, you look at the two of them, if they're reasonably close, then my next step would be to ask the student if he or she has a preference. Did you love one of them? Did you hate one of them? And then go from there. If they're sort of neutral, and they do very well on both, then I would suggest that they take both of them for real and then ask that question again. So how are the scores? Are they reasonably close? Sometimes a good score on one element of one of the tests can offset not such a good score on that same element on the other one. Let me give you a specific example. The SAT math is concepts. It's how well have you internalized the concepts so that you can access those concepts that because a lot of the SAT is not pencil on paper doing computations. It's just not, it's concepts. So a student who is a good math student does the homework, gets good grades, but is not the math whiz of the Western world, is fine doing, a test on Unit 5 because she's done her homework. She understands it when it's taught, but she doesn't have that deep level of understanding of the concepts. So a student like that may not do spectacularly well on the SAT math, but a student like that could do really well on the ACT math, because ACT math is computational. It's here's a problem, do the problem, okay? Pencil on paper. So if you take both, and that's your profile, you're a humanities student more so than a STEM student, then having the SAT and the ACT both can give the colleges a little better of a picture. Here's a student who does her homework, understands if she's taught, but math is maybe not her thing. So they can kind of boost each other. They can fill in the blanks a little bit better. Okay, that's just one example. Did that come close to answering your question?
Sure, sure did. One last question I have now is, you talk about the potential of students taking the same test more than one time in order to improve their performances. And like Mahiti said, she took the ACT twice. How much is enough and how much is too much? How many times? And when do you think this is it?
Okay, enough for a wonderful student like Mahati was twice. That's fine. 2 ACTs, if they're at that level, is enough. 2 SATs at that same level is enough. If a student takes both, then if they're reasonably close scores wise, then I would say take them each again. So 4 times max. 5 is bordering on too many times. Okay. If a student takes both and one of them is obviously better than the other, then the not so good one can pretend like she didn't take it at all, and she can take the one that she did better on up to 2 more times. So 2 for those wonderful students like Mahati, up to 5 in certain circumstances, but I would say 3 or 4 is most common and just about right.
Thank you. That about covers all the questions that we have. So, Poonam?
Yeah, I think we're almost nearing 5 o'clock. So unless anyone has any questions, I think we're gonna end this webinar. Also, if you think of any questions, please send us an email to CollegeConnect and we will try to get you an answer for that. So thank you, Donna. Thank you, Mahiti, for attending. Thank you all for joining us. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.